I am really excited about today's topic because I think disenfranchised grief of being childless is something that many of us feel, but we may not have the language or understanding of like exactly what it is. I know when I first learned about this concept, it was really pretty life-changing for me because it put to words something that I had been feeling for a long time and didn't really understand. So having the language and context was just so helpful. And I'm especially excited to be here with Dr. Darroux because she has done her dissertation on this topic specifically. But yeah, welcome everyone. Okay, so Dr. Darroux, let me give your bio here. So Dr. Nisa Darroux has a diverse background in child welfare operations, counseling, and financial management. She has a doctorate degree in EDD in community care and counseling with an emphasis in marriage and family. She's also a certified public accountant. And her dissertation, which is the topic of our conversation today, was for her doctoral degree and is an analysis of the disenfranchised grief of involuntarily childless women. And as an involuntarily childless woman herself, Nisa felt that it was important to create awareness of the loss and grief experienced by women who are childless not by choice, seeing that their grief is often ignored, invalidated, and minimized. She loves orchids and has a number of them in her home and is also a big lover of music, especially instrumental jazz. I love jazz too. So yes, it's so great to have you here. And did I miss anything in your bio that you want to tell us about?
No, I think that pretty much captures it for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, well, let's just jump in because I know this is we had so many people RSVP for this event. I think it's one of the most we've had in a long time. So I think people are really eager to hear about this topic. So I will just jump in with my first question for you, which is, and for those of us who might not be familiar with the terms disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss, can you just tell us a bit about what these are and how they apply to those who are childless?
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining Katie and myself here for this webinar. We are grateful that you are here with us. So when someone has a loss, grief is the outcome of that loss. It's a natural response when someone loses a loved one. To disenfranchise someone means that you deprive them of the right to do something. And so disenfranchised grief refers to grief that is not openly acknowledged, is not supported by one's social networks, and is not mourned in public like a funeral, for instance. So we see, therefore, that this grief is more or less, it's hidden or it's invisible. Ambiguous loss is a loss which is not very clear. It's uncertain. It's the kind of loss that triggers questions such as, was there a loss? What exactly was lost? And so it's kind of a gray area, if you want to call it that. It's not very clear cut. Now, to illustrate this, let's take, for instance, someone lost a loved one. And we know that social etiquette will determine that they send cards, flowers, you'll call the person, you'll text them, you'll express your sympathy. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that you lost XYZ. And we will be there showing our support. Conversely, let's look at involuntary childless woman who may have been trying to get pregnant the traditional way through sexual intercourse, may have tried a couple rounds of IVF, may have tried adoption, but everything that she tried did not work out. There may be a few people in her circle who know that she was doing that. And even those people, sometimes it's hard for them to relate to the fact that, hey, this failure to, achieve having a child is a loss. And so we find that because the loss is so ambiguous, people can't relate to it. They have nothing concrete or tangible to look at and say, yes, this was there and now it's no longer there. Because many times that's how we view loss. We think about having something and then not having it, right? We don't think about the fact that loss can also be about an opportunity or not having options, so it's not always tangible to say, well, the loss relates to this particular thing. Now, Kenneth Doka, who is the originator of the disenfranchised grief theory, he talks about societal guidelines where society tells us, who we can mourn, how we should mourn them, and how we should relate to the person that is dealing with the grief, right? So because involuntary childlessness is not necessarily viewed as a loss by society, there are no social guidelines as to what to do. Do you send flowers to someone who is grieving the loss of not becoming a mother or a father? Do you, just write them a little note? Do you text them? What do you do? So if the loss is not recognized, it follows that the grief will not be recognized, right? People who are childless, not by choice, experience disenfranchised grief because those in their social networks do not understand the loss and the grief. They can't relate to it. And because they can't relate to it, it's hard for them to provide support. One of my participants in my study, she said, they don't see it as grief, which is so true. Another participant said, there's nothing in society that acknowledges this grief. Not at my work, not at my church, nowhere. When people are grieving, the tendency is that we surround them, we draw close to them, we provide support. However, people tend to shy away from what they do not know. And herein lies the difficulty with the loss and grief of involuntary childlessness.
Yeah, and I would imagine, I'm just thinking about my own experience and times where maybe someone did reach out with support or acknowledgement, and I think it's typically, like I may have gotten like phone calls or something from when I had my failed IVF cycle, or when I had my surgery with my hysterectomy. My workplace sent me flowers, and my sister sent me flowers. I would imagine that for those who are maybe single and childless, or childless by circumstance, where they also don't have those kind of moments of the physical element of people being able to see, like, oh, she's having surgery, so I can recognize. We have some kind of guidelines for, like, if someone's having a hard time with surgery, maybe you bring them a casserole, or you like send them flowers or something. So I would imagine this is really layered, and that those who or maybe single by circumstance, or sorry, childless by circumstance, that they end up maybe feeling this in a different way as well.
Yes, Katie, you're absolutely right, because I had a couple of participants that were single, and they told me that, being single is another layer in this world and this journey of being involuntary childless, because like a couple of my participants, there was one who she was married and was now divorced. There was one who was never married, but she had that desire to have a child, but she wanted to have the child within a marriage, right? There was another participant who wanted to have a child, not necessarily a marriage, but just a partnership that was stable. And so people have different goals for their lives. They want to do things in certain ways. And so I think for those persons, it is even harder for them, because people don't recognize that they are grieving, the loss of just not achieving that goal.
Yeah. So for those of us who are childless, not by choice, which I'm guessing is most of the participants here, although I hope that we may have some like practitioners too, maybe therapists or others who are wanting to learn more about working with clients who are childless, not by choice. How can we like recognize where disenfranchised grief may be showing up for us? Like, what are some ways that might show up in our lives? What would it look like?
So we can usually know when our grief is being disenfranchised based on the type of response that we receive when we express our grief. So, do we feel like we're being shut down? Is the topic being changed? Is it just radio silence? Does the body language change? The person starts shifting, or they look away, or like what exactly goes on when we express our grief? For instance, this week, I was feeling a bit griefy about just, looking at a report that I had that talked about my uterus not being there because I had a hysterectomy. And I felt sad, and I just posted in Lighthouse, and I had so much support. Now, what if I had just called one of my friends and said, yeah, I saw this report, and man, just seeing that I had a hysterectomy is just bumming me out. And then I get silence, like, are you there? Hello? Hey. Yeah, so when are you going to go to Toronto? That would be the question the person asked me. And I'm like, what? I'm pouring my heart out to you, and you're asking me about a trip? So stuff like that, you can know exactly, just like, yeah, this person is not trying to, provide support. Maybe they can't, maybe they don't know how, but they become uncomfortable. So, the shift takes place and you're not really addressing the need I have right now. There is a
Yeah.
marked difference between someone saying, are you still sad about not having kids?
Mm.
As opposed to, I don't really understand your childless grief, but you know what? I'm here for you.
Yeah.
It's completely different.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think just in talking to so many childless women over the years, I have seen a lot of these examples of people saying, I tried to share this with my family or a friend, and they literally said nothing. It was just silence, and it was so awkward. Or, I said it and they changed the subject. All these things that you just mentioned of how this looks are definitely examples I've heard. So I'm so glad that we're talking about this. And so I know that your dissertation had kind of 6 key themes that came up in your findings. And so I thought we could kind of just go through and look at them and hear a little bit more from you about these themes. So the first one was having a lack of acknowledgement and support. And I pulled out this quote from one of the participants that I thought really illustrated this. Your participant, Bethany, said, they didn't understand the depth of emotion I was going through. And I think it was just too much for them to handle and to hold a space for me. And that really hit me because I think that sometimes it could be that people aren't recognizing our grief, or sometimes they don't understand it, and they don't have the capacity to hold that space. And so this quote just really hit me when I read it. Tell us a little bit about like what some of the themes are that came up in your conversations around this lack of acknowledgement and support.
So under this theme kind of showed how people felt like that their grief was not being supported or even recognized. And so there were like 3 themes that kind of came up under this topic. The first one was unsolicited and unhelpful advice. Now, oftentimes, sometimes when you're going through something, there are some people who think that I need to give you some advice, right? But when people are in a situation where their like emotions are, raw, open, they're going through a grief, they don't always need advice or want advice. Sometimes they just want you to listen, to just be there. But one very popular piece of advice that woman in this study got was, well, you can just adopt, get a foster kid. It's almost as if you were saying, well, just buy some detergent at the store. It was so just off the cuff, just like, oh, well, you know what's the issue? Just adopt a child, just get a foster kid. And I will say this, there were some persons who they had an interest in doing that, but there were other people who expressly stated that this is not something that I want to do, right? There was one participant who she told, friends and family that my husband and I have decided we do not want to adopt. But that did not stop them from sending her texts of names of adoption agencies and places she could go and check out, and just kept going. So people sometimes they think they're helping because they're giving you options or advice, but it would be more helpful to ask the person, so is this something that you would consider, or are you thinking about so and so, so that the person doesn't, you're not adding to their grief by pushing stuff on them that is not something which they want to do. One participant said, for me, she said she has a science background. I just wanted to be able to produce a child. It's not about adoption or fostering. That was a goal I had for my life. And so we have to see people where they're at. We have to understand their life goals before we can relate to them to say, well, hey, what about doing this? What about doing that? Because that may not be a part of the person's life goals. So,
Yeah. Oh,
go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that advice piece comes up so much. And I think a lot of times the person giving the advice doesn't have an understanding always of what that would entail. So it may be, or like what your personal circumstances is. So it may be easy to say like, you should do IVF, whether you're single or partnered, like you can, do some kind of fertility intervention, have your own kid. Well, they might not know that the cost that's involved in that, the additional cost if you're single and we're wanting to do fertility treatments as someone who's single. They don't understand probably the success rates. And so Yeah, I think that the advice is often really misplaced, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this idea that, well, if someone wants to become a parent, they obviously can if they just try all these different routes, and not a lot of acknowledgement of why someone they might not be right for someone. So yeah, I definitely see a lot of that too. And I'm sorry, you were just coming up, you were going to say something else.
Yeah. Well, before I say what I was about to say, based on what you just said about thinking it, if you really wanted it, then you could have done it kind of thing.
Mhm.
I had one participant who spent over $80,000 on IVF and she still does not have a child.
Yeah.
So just to say that this, you can do this, there's no guarantee to say, okay, if I do this, then, my desire in my heart is going to be fulfilled. It doesn't work like that, you know?
Mhm.
So another thing that came up under lack of acknowledgement was also insensitive comments. Like, people got comments like, well, at least you didn't have a miscarriage.
Mhm.
There are worse things in life. Just have faith in God.
Mhm.
It's not the same as someone who lost a real child. Like, really, people? And these are actual things that were said to people. People express their grief, and this is the kind of response that they're getting.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that if I was like, at a 5 in a hole, by the time I'm finished talking to this person, I am already at a 1. I'm just like at the bottom of the well, because here it
Yeah.
is. I'm trying to lift myself out, trying to get some support. And then here we are, that you are just, making me feel worse than I already feel.
Yeah.
Also, under lack of acknowledgement, people had social challenges. They lost their friends. I think it was Jody who called it the friend apocalypse. Yeah,
Mhm.
they lost their friends. One participant said even people who were bridesmaids in her wedding, they no longer have that kind of close relationship because
Yeah.
things have changed, and so has as the relationship. People talked about not having much of a social life outside of like their support circles that they get support from for their involuntary childlessness, and so they don't get a lot of invitations to parties and other events and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And some people, they get invited, but they just don't go because they know what it's going to be like when they're in that. It's all like the topic always turns to motherhood or children or this or pregnancy or whatever, and then how do you relate? It's
Yeah.
very hard. That's one of the reasons why I have to stop going to baby showers, because I'm just like, yeah, no is a word, and we need to learn to use that word.
Yeah.
So am I coming? No, I'm not coming, because I know that, my grief is just going to be heightened when I'm getting all that talk, which I can't contribute to. So, it it's really hard sometimes. You want to have the social circle, absolutely, but at what cost? And I'm not saying
Mhm.
that people need to abandon all their family and friends, but I think we just have to have boundaries and know where you are. Some days you're good, some
Yeah.
days you're not so good. So I think just take your temperature, see where you're at, and then decide what you can deal with.
Mhm. Um, yeah, I can see in the comments that people are making that there's a lot of validation in just hearing you say that. A lot of people are, sharing their stories, or talking about how this has shown up for them. So you're definitely hitting the nail on the head with this one. So the second one that came up was emotional issues. So I pulled out a quote from this one as well. So your participant, Amy, said, I think it's made me question everything. Who am I if I'm not going to be a mom? And for a while, a lot of other things went into this. But I think not being a mom was a big part of what am I going to do with my life? And how am I going to feel worth if I'm not raising a child? And it's really made me question, I'm only 30, so what am I going to do with myself? So I think when we're talking about losses, this idea of that ambiguous loss piece of we're also losing part of this identity that we had planned to hold in the future, and the vision that we had created of what our lives might look like, and planning around that and holding space in our lives for that. A lot of us could picture ourselves as parents and maybe even made decisions with life planning around becoming parents. And so I think, it kind of all goes into this. I love the identity and purpose piece got brought up in this as well. And I think I'd like to start there with this piece. So with this issue of identity and purpose, again, it's an identity that we never held. So we didn't necessarily lose it, but we lost the dream or the vision that we had of what that would be like. And at the same time, not being a mom brings up so many issues around this identity and purpose piece. So what are the most significant findings that you saw around this identity and purpose piece?
So with regards to identity of being a mom, as you have said, even though we didn't lose it, as it were, but we lost the opportunity to have it. And as I talked about life goals, if this was one of your life goals, and now, the door is closed and that's it, then that creates a void in your spirit, right? Because now you've come to the realization that, hey, this is not going to happen, all along I held out hope, it may, maybe not, but then, there comes a point like a hysterectomy, okay, well, that's it, the door is closed and it's never going to happen, right? So as I said previously, losses are not always about, having something concrete that you no longer have, but it's about losing that opportunity. And, based on what that, desire meant for you, it can be huge. It can be just like really, really hard just to come to grips with the fact that, hey, this is not going to happen. So now we have to find a way forward without having this desire being fulfilled. In society, the general idea is that, being a mother or parenthood, for, just to include the man, is a natural order of life. It's like, okay, so you go through schooling, you're a child, you're a teenager, you go to college, you get married, and then it's almost as if you just tick the box. Okay, went to college, got married, and the next box is had children. But what happens when that box just cannot be ticked because of life circumstances, right? Or whatever has happened that is acted as a barrier for you not being able to have a child. What happens then? So for the woman in my study, they talked about feeling inadequate, feeling flawed, feeling not fully a woman, like just the quote you just read from that participant about what am I going to do with my life if I'm not going to be a mom? It's like, what do I do now kind of thing? Because the expectation in society is that this is what, you will do. And so when that does not happen, one person said she felt like she was viewed negatively by society. People talked about feeling inadequate, not good enough. And so it was just all, these kind of feelings of just feeling so, less than, just not really meeting the mark. There are so many, messages out there in society, like, womanhood is equal to motherhood. So it's almost as if you're a woman, then you should be a mother. That's one message, and sometimes we hear the message, well, you don't understand because you're not a mother. So it's almost as if, well, you are, you have a deficit then because you're not a mother. So there's no way you can relate to what I'm saying over here. So all that kind of a messaging and just the, the stereotypes and everything in society, it feeds into that whole thing that creates stigma. And so if you're not a mother, it's, you're looked at kind of weird. People have all these suspicions and, assumptions about who you are. One of my participants was at her job and they were having a call with people who were working remotely. And so someone had their baby on the call and everyone was like, oh, he's so cute. And she was very quiet. After the call, someone said to her, what's wrong with you? Don't you like babies? Why didn't you say anything when Jane took her baby on, or whoever the person's name was? You were just quiet. Like, what's the matter? Now, I thought that was so rude and so invasive. You don't know my story. Why are you talking to me like this? And the person was just at her and I was just like who does that? You don't know what people are going through. Why do you assume that she didn't like babies? The woman was in her grief, but of course, nobody knew that. She didn't share her story with her work colleagues, so they didn't know. But I'm saying, why would that be the first assumption that you would make? That she doesn't like kids, it's just the weirdest thing. Incidentally, that same participant, she said she felt so inadequate and she gave me an illustration about the Titanic. She said, you know what? I can just imagine if I was on the Titanic and they're deciding who to go first, who to go second, and who to go, get off the ship. I can just imagine them saying, oh, she's just a childless woman. She can go down with the ship. That was how bad she felt about how she was treated, because she just could not wrap her head around just all that was happening and just how she was viewed by people. She felt like she was not worthy. So it's very hard. It's very difficult, to the whole identity piece and purpose and self-worth. It's been hit hard. I will tell you that.
Yeah.
Very hard.
Well, and I think it makes sense because we get societal messages our entire life, which really equates womanhood and what it means to be a woman with becoming a mom. And we don't get like an alternative message of, here is how you're still like a worthy person if you don't have kids. And I know sometimes I've even asked, like on Instagram, I'll put a sticker in my stories that just asks, like, who is one of your childless or child-free role models? And a lot of times people can't name anyone. And so I think part of this is that we don't have the role. I mean, they're out there, but it's like you have to look for those role models. We have to look for examples of how people are living fulfilled lives without kids. And those are harder to find because it's not the narrative that society tells us how our life should look. So I am going to put in the chat like 3 different places that I have found for this that I really love as a resource if you're looking for good child-free, childless role models, or even just hearing people's stories. So one is, there's a podcast called Unclassified Woman. It's by Michelle Marie McGrath, and I think there's like 300 episodes, and they're all just her interviewing women who are either childless or child-free, and she just talks to them about kind of what their lives are like, just asking them questions. The other is a similar podcast is done by Dr. Angela Harris, who does she has a website called No Bibs, Burps, and Bottles. So she's child-free by choice, but and most of her guests are child-free by choice. But I think in terms of, even though the experiences are different, in terms of hearing from women who are happy without kids and able to create a life that feels fulfilling and meaningful, it's really nice for me, I think, to hear their stories as well. And then the third is a guest that I'm going to have on next month, for those who are part of Lighthouse Women, which is, her name is Emma, and she does on Instagram, she's at, what's it called? Let's see, Millennial Emma. And she just highlights child-free and childless women throughout history. And her whole account is just highlighting different people. And then she started an online museum, which I didn't understand how it would work, but you go on to this website and it's beautiful. It looks like you're in a museum. It's gorgeous. And you can just look at portraits of child-free and childless women and read their stories. So I'm going to add all of those. I see a lot of you are asking where to find these. I'll add them in the chat while we continue to talk here. But those are 3 resources where if you're just looking for like some guidance or hearing stories of how other people have found meaning and identity and all of these things outside of motherhood, I think you'll find a lot of just gold there. So sorry for the detour, Nisa, but I thought that was important to mention.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the other part of this kind of emotional issues theme that came up was the common emotions that seem to be pretty across the board for your participants. So can you tell us about some of these common emotions that seem to come up for the women that you interviewed?
Well, of course, the major emotion was grief, right? And just for some persons, they talked about just lifelong grief. I had one participant who has been involuntary childless for 24 years, and while I was going through the interview, there were tears in her eyes. And the way she came across, I could tell that 24 years later, she was still grieving the loss of not being able to have a child. And so I think this lifelong grief, this grief at different stages of life, because, at first you grieve not being able to have the child, right? Then there's the graduation that you will not be going to for your son or your daughter. Then there are the weddings that you will not be going to for your son or your daughter. Then there are the grandchildren that you're not going to have, So it's all these different layers and these different important events and milestones that you're never going to have. Like for me, sometimes I think to myself, I'll never hear somebody say, Mom, that's not going to be my story. So the grief becomes so complicated, and it stretches out over your lifetime because of all these different things. I'll often say to people, it's not like, okay, yeah, I got a wound and now, it's healed and everything is great. I'm good. That's not how this childless grief works. It's just it's too complicated, too layered, too nuanced. There's just too many things that are going on and too many things going on over a period of time. So, the grief gets harder because it's so prolonged. There was also a lot of sadness. People talked about having, just crying all the time, just feeling sad. And sometimes, based on the kind of triggers that they receive out in society, that causes, the sadness to come on. It's not there all the time, but, there have been times when, people have like literally felt depressed because of just how, this dream has just not materialized. Another big one was anger. And some persons actually said rage. They were just like really angry, and they were angry, in different ways. Some people were angry at the lack of social awareness that people have, where they just completely not understand that this is grief. Let me have my grief, and let me go through it, and don't tell me this is not grief because you don't know exactly how I'm feeling. For the Christians who were, part of my study, they felt anger at God because, they're like, why would you give me a desire to have children and then not allow me to have any? Like, who does that? What kind of God are you? So there was anger towards God, because of that. Some people, they stopped going to church, and that kind of a thing. So the anger was just like, anger at circumstances. One participant had a chronic illness, and that was the reason why she could not have children. And so she was angry at her circumstances because she's like, because of my illness, this has robbed me of becoming a mom. So, and also loneliness was a big one too. People felt lonely, they felt isolated because they could think back to, having friends, having support, and they saw their social circles the shrinking, as they tried to deal with their grief. They felt alone because, the friends that they have, not everyone was still here with them, or if they had the friends, they weren't getting the kind of support that they needed. So it was a lot of emotions that people went through. Shame and guilt, just in terms of, could I have done something differently? Could I have done more? Did I not do enough? Was there something that I missed? So just trying to go through and see, okay, where did I drop the ball kind of thing? So that causes a lot of guilt for some people, and just a shame because of the stigma that society attaches to people who do not have children. People bear that shame a lot because they just don't know how else to relate. So they internalize it to feel that, well, I'm not a good person. I'm not a worthy person. And so the shame sits in their spirit. So it was a lot that was going on with different people.
Yeah, and I think this one ties in so much to that, our feelings not being acknowledged by most people. And so it can be really hard because if you recognize that you're feeling these things and you want someone to talk to about it, but you try to talk to your family and friends and get invalidated, or sometimes even, I hear stories of therapists who are not trained on how to work with those who are childless not by choice, and say a lot of the same awful things that we get told by others in society, that even the places where we go to try to turn for help, we get misunderstood. And I think that can just kind of amplify those feelings and amplify that shame of like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about this. I'm not supposed to feel this, because every time I try to talk about it, it's being invalidated. It's being misunderstood. I'm getting advice that tells me to just keep trying to have a kid. And I think that yeah, the emotions piece is so big. And I think, maybe wouldn't have quite as much impact if we had better avenues in society of people who understood and could validate and acknowledge and care for us in the way that they can with like other issues.
Yeah, that piece that you said about counselors, Katie, it's a big deal because, one of my participants, she tried to go to counseling, and then the counselor looked at her and said, so you're here because you can't have kids? That just floored me because I just could not understand, why would you say something like that to a person, to a client? Even if this is not your area of specialty or something, it's just being kind. That was such a horrible thing to say to, I mean, right off the bat, you're invalidating the person because you're making them feel as if, well, you should not be here for this. Before even hearing like the fullness of their story, you're going to ask that question, so and I think what makes it worse, as you said, this is a place where you think you're going to be helped, right? And then you do not get the help, and then you feel worse. And then you may have even paid some money, making it even worse, worse.
Right. Because like you should never be responsible for having to educate your therapist. Like that is their job to have the understanding of like what you're going through.
Absolutely.
And I found even therapists who specialized in infertility, for those who went the infertility route, that even therapists specializing in infertility were not, and many of them are not able to help you transition to what it's going to be like if you end up being childless. And they end up a lot of the times doing the same things of like, well, why don't you try doing this? Why don't you try doing this? And if you say like, I'm not trying anything else, they have no understanding of how to kind of like help transition you into what your life is going to look like. So yeah, this is a big one.
Yeah,
so,
and I just saw in the comments where someone said they had a therapist said to them, I never had kids and I'm okay. But the thing
so invalidating.
The thing is that that's your life story. That's not my story. And why are you telling me that? Like, is that supposed to make me feel better? So it's just like when this wasn't a therapist, this was my doctor. And so a cardiologist, and I went there and she said, do you have kids? I'm like, no. Oh, don't worry, they're not great anyways. It's not all expected to be. So I went back to her after like about 2 years. And of course, she asked the same question, right? And I said to her, do you ask this question of all your female patients? She's like, yeah, mainly, most of the times. And then I said, for some people, this is a very hard question. For people who wanted to have children and they could not have children, this is not a question that makes them feel good. So you may want to reconsider asking that question of your female clients. And she said, well, usually when they say no, I just, I don't say anything. And I thought to myself, and I know you're lying, because the last time I was here, when I said no, you told me that it was not that of a big of a deal or anything, but I just, I just thought to myself, it's so hard sometimes to educate people, because I know what you said the last time I was here. And now I'm telling you, you need to check yourself and not ask people this question. But you're trying to, like, as it were, justify, well, if they say no, I just kind of, tail off the conversation. I'm not taper off the conversation. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, no, you did not. So you see how hard it is sometimes, right? That people who should be professionals, who are in caring professions, as it were, are not so very caring.
Yeah. Well, and if you're experiencing really like levels of grief, it's very hard to be in a place where you can advocate for yourself, or want to have that energy to have to try to educate or advocate for yourself. And I had a similar experience actually at the dentist. I went to a new dentist, and she had pulled up my medications chart of like medications I'd taken recently, and one of the ones that was on there was an infertility related medication. And she said, oh, what are you taking this for? And I said, oh, it was for an infertility treatment. And she said, oh, how long have you been going through infertility? And I said, oh, like 3 years. And she said, oh, well, my friend went through it for 10 years and had a kid. So just keep going. You're brand new to this. 3 years is nothing. Keep going. And I was like, oh, why? You're a dentist. Why are you giving me advice on this? Like, please don't. I just want you to work on my teeth. Like, just get back to my teeth. I don't want to talk to you about this at all. But and it's funny because now I can advocate for myself in different ways and maybe respond differently. But at the time I was still in the middle of treatments, I was just experiencing so much grief. I didn't know how to talk about it. If I tried to talk about it, I burst into tears. So it was just like, it felt impossible to even try to have those conversations. So yeah, it's hard.
It is hard.
So I know that you brought up a little bit about this this theme that came up of questioning faith, or this faith piece. And this was the third theme that came from your research. And so I pulled out another quote, which is a little bit longer, but I really, really liked it. So I'm going to read the whole thing. And this was from your participant, Sophia. And she said, well, I definitely feel like there's no place for single childless people in the Catholic Church at this age. There's nothing geared towards you. I mean, the homilies are always around families and marriage and kids. I rarely hear single childless people even mentioned. So yeah, you just feel invisible and left out. And when I go to church, I look around and it's either families or elderly people, and I'm like the only one that's standing there by myself. And again, you don't get to take part in any of those rituals. You're never going to have a child be baptized or make their first communion. It's just you can't really fit into the community because you don't have the right connection. Children are what glues everybody together in church, right? So I just thought that was so powerful. And I think it also kind of leads back to some of the other things we talked to around tradition and milestones. And I think when you have kids, there so much of your life does become about following their milestones, and those become things you look forward to and things that you celebrate. So it's like, my baby just had their first birthday and now they're going to kindergarten and now they're doing whatever. And it's like you have kind of this life script that follows milestones of where you're going to engage. And I think that also ties into traditions and religion and all of those traditional spaces in our lives where so many milestones or traditions do revolve around those moments for your kids, like this, how she brought up like communion and baptism. And so I would just love to hear about some of the issues that came up for your participants around faith and how their childlessness impacted their faith.
Well, one of the big things was, just in terms of not being able to find a place of belonging in church, because as the participant said, everything is about families and children. And another thing was, in reading the Bible, they couldn't identify anyone who struggled to get pregnant who, never had a child. When you think about the Sarahs of this world, the Elizabeth and whatever, it's like they were 90, they were 105, but yet still they had a child. And it's like, that's not my experience. So how is it that I'm going to be relating to a Bible and a God and, what's written in the Bible, which is the book that we're using, doesn't even speak to my experience. Like everyone that we can think about, Hannah, after she went to the temple and she prayed and everything, then she had 5 kids. And so it's like, there is no one there that I can see myself in. So it was very hard, and not having the support and people in church that can hold space was another issue. Another issue I think sometimes is just how people in the church community think everything is about prayer and faith. Oh, just pray about it, just pray about it. And, that is the solution to everything. They think that, okay, fine, you don't have enough faith. It's almost always about what you don't have or what you didn't do. But people of faith need to understand that not everything is spiritual, people. The same God who, we're serving made us as emotional beings, and we have emotions. And some things have to do with our emotions. And just telling me to pray about it is not going to fix the brokenness in my spirit. And even the same Bible tells you that a merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones, right? So the very Bible that we like to quote so much, it does address the fact that you need to fix your emotions, because emotions are tied to spirituality. So when your emotions are not good, then it's going to affect spirituality and everything else. So the struggle was, do I still go to church? Do I not? Some people actually did not go anymore. Some went sometimes, and one person left and they went back and they were trying to organize a childless group within their church. I don't know how that went because I've not been in contact with them since the study, but those were pretty much what happened in terms of those who had, they were believers. That was their experience. But it was very hard though. They said it was so hard because they really wanted to hold on to their faith, but they just could not find it. It wasn't helpful for them, they said. And they couldn't anchor themselves in it because they just didn't find solace among the church community. So it was very hard.
Well, and I'd imagine, there's so many conversations now about diversity and inclusion and belonging. And I think that churches could really just make some pretty basic shifts in how they talk about certain things and making sure they have programming or, things that are inclusive of people who are childless. I think it could be fixed if maybe pastors became more aware of the needs and could just kind of alter some of their language or how they talk about certain things or the programming. Because I think what happens, it sounds like, is part of what's happening in all these other areas of you try to find a counselor, you try to talk to your family, you try to talk to your friends, you try to go to your pastor, go to your church. And it's just this invisible feeling of, I'm not being seen, I'm not being acknowledged, I'm not being supported. And it's just when it starts happening in all these different avenues, I think it can just really make those feelings of shame and guilt. And I think, like you were saying, within a context of faith, seeing it as a deficit, if you're being told, well, it's because you didn't pray hard enough, or you didn't have enough faith, or you didn't have enough hope, or whatever it is, that can really start to go towards that self-worth piece of, well, what is wrong with me? How come my friend prayed and she got a baby, and but God didn't give me a baby? And it's
Right.
this, like, just really doubling down on those things we're already feeling about guilt and shame and self-worth. So yeah, I can see how this is a big one.
Yeah, but as you talked about that, I remain hopeful because I believe that little by little the word is getting out.
Yeah.
Like one of my friends, and she just posted that in the chat a while ago about her pastor preaching about childlessness. And I did listen to that sermon, and I have to commend him, that he actually had the courage to take the bull by the horns and actually talk about it. I don't know what he's doing in his actual, congregation about it, but one thing I did like about what he did was that he referenced a reverend who is also involuntary childless, a woman, and that she was working with a number of people, and he had her information. If people wanted to work with her, he would provide that. So I thought that was just really commendable, because the fact is, if you're not going to be able to provide the support within your congregation, then provide a resource like that reverend lady who was doing that. I thought that was commendable, that he provided that resource, that people, if they wanted to make contact with that person, they could do that. So at least that is something. It's not nothing,
Absolutely. And I think the same way, I mentioned in the chat that, like, Katie Maynard is someone who provides education to therapists about how to better understand and serve the needs of childless clients. I would love to see someone who is really embedded into, like, church communities to put together, like, it'd be cool if we had someone who's doing that similarly, where they could put together resource guides that could be shared with pastors, that could be shared with faith leaders, of, like, here are some concrete ways that you can make some adjustments to make the community feel more inclusive. I know I had a woman named Anne Brock who does I don't know exactly what her title is. She's not a pastor, but she runs some kind of programming within her church, and her degree is in divinity. And she spoke at the 2021 summit that I hosted about how communities of faith could be more inclusive. And she had some really great suggestions. I would love the idea of, like, someone putting together, like, a toolkit that could just be shared with their faith leaders and say, hey, can you consider this, Okay, so the next theme that came up was around family tension. And this one I hear about all the time. And you had a participant, Madeline, who said, it's not something we talk about, in part because I know they have their own grief about it, and I cannot carry their grief as well as mine. And I think that is so true. And it reminds me of this, I can't remember what it's called, but it's this, like, graphic that shows, if you're in the center of what's happening and the grief that you're experiencing, who's allowed to complain and, like, who has to hold space for others. And if you're in the center, you really just can focus on your own grief. And then people who are affected by it as well, like, I hear all the time, well, my parent is so upset because they wanted to be a grandparent, and they tell me that, and it makes me feel even worse because now I'm carrying their guilt and their feelings around not being able to become, the ring theory, about not being able to become a parent. And how much does that add to us, that we now have to not only try to hold and navigate our own grief, but now we're having to try to hold and manage other people's grief. It's just it feels so big. So what were some of the themes that came up around this family tensions piece?
Well, what you just mentioned about, people feeling guilty that they could not provide their parents with grandchildren. People also felt that they were treated differently from their siblings who had children. They felt that because they did not, have children, they were not, treated in the very same manner, almost that they were treated less than. So there were some people who felt that. There was one participant who said, she has had to, just educate her family about the grief that she's going through. Sometimes, it's not so bad with them, but other times she still has to fight just to get a little support from them. So, you find that causes, a wedge in the family when you have to be having conflicts about, not feeling supported, not getting what you think that they could be, more there for you kind of thing. So you find that sort of put a wedge in. And I had one participant who she gave an experience where she talked about, she got engaged and she went by her family members to introduce her fiance to her family members. So she went there, they sat down, had a meal, whatever. And she said, this is my fiance. And people just kind of nodded, not really saying anything. And so she left. When she went home, she called and she said, what happened today? I took my fiance here and nobody congratulated me. And they said, well, you can't have children, so we didn't think you're going to get married. That floored me literally, because I just could not believe that your family members could say that to you. And I could see the context in which they were coming from, because for them, in their culture, family is a big thing. Children, family, it's a big deal. It's a collectivism culture. But even and still, it's just like to say that to someone that you didn't think you're going to get married, you can't have kids. So here again, it's almost like marriage is equal to children, because it's like if you're married, then you should have kids. So one follows the other, whatever the sequence is. But it's like it was being equated right there that, the fact that she didn't have kids, then they didn't think she was going to get married. So hence, no congratulations.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely
really heartbreaking.
Awful, awful, awful.
Well, I think one of the hardest things that about like being someone who holds space in this community for people is just hearing these stories over and over of just what people are carrying. It's just so, it feels so big, and people can just be so cruel and have so much ignorance around what we experience. It's just, I've said this before, I think the grief that I felt around a few things that happened to me all at the same time. So my childlessness, my endometriosis, and how late I got diagnosed. And yeah, I think those are the two big ones. But what I found is that when I would talk to people, I felt like my pain was unique, my grief was unique, and it is in its own way. But at the same time, I'd start hearing other people's stories, and it just broke my heart how we're all collectively experiencing this massive grief and trying to navigate in a world that is not very understanding and is not responding in the way that we need, or supporting us in the way that we need, and just seeing how many are going through that too. That I felt isolated, like I was going through this and it felt so big. And then hearing other people's stories and saying, oh, there's so many that are carrying the same weight. And it breaks my heart. I hope that with more public voices around this, we can start to kind of change the narrative, because it's one thing to be able to build the support within our own community. But I think the next step is, how do we get the word out there to just general public, so that, because there's only so much we can do within our community. But that's a whole different conversation that I could go on and on about.
Yeah, yeah. But I can agree with you though, Katie, that, I think little by little the word is getting out. Since I did my study and graduated in May last year, my study has been downloaded like 225 times. So I'm hoping that, of that 220 something, that there are people there who just give them a little bit of education as to how to, work or to, be socialized as it pertains to us. So I don't know who these people are, but, I'm just hoping that there are people there who can, little by little effect change somewhat by being educated.
I hope so too. it feels very weird that it's, 2023 and these conversations are kind of just happening. I mean, I know there are definitely people who have been leaders in this field. Jody Day's been doing this for 10 years, and there are others, but the just the lack of conversation in society around the needs of childless people and understanding the experience. I mean, there's been childless people since the beginning of human existence. So the fact that it's taken this long for it to become more of a public conversation and for those things to start happening is just thinking about all the generations of people who have been having to deal with this silently and without the community support is just really hard to wrap my head around in 2023.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I've got a couple more questions for you, and just if you're joining, just know I'm guessing we'll go for another about 30 minutes because I have a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure that we can get into some of your questions that you have for Dr. Darroux. So we will go a little bit longer. It is being recorded, so if you were only planning to be here for an hour, feel free to hop off and watch the last 30 minutes later. But I don't want to cut this off because I feel like it's a really good, in-depth, meaty conversation that needs to happen. So okay, so Nisa, what about coping mechanisms? So this piece I think is so important because it starts to kind of highlight, well, here are the issues that we know a lot of us experience. How can we start to cope with this? Where can we turn for support? So what were some of the coping mechanisms that your participants said they found most helpful?
So coping mechanisms, participants, they did counseling, journaling, just writing about their story, creating little rituals, and support groups. By far, support groups was like the biggest thing. It was like the bomb, because that was what people found. Like, they really found a place where they could just be. You don't have to explain, and try to get support. The support is already there because here's another person who is going through it just the way you are. We may have different circumstances, but we're in the same room. So I may have used the route, around here to get there. You may have come from the front, the back, the side, but we're in the same room. And so this person understands you. When you speak, you don't need to translate and say, oh, well, by this I mean X, because they already know. And how great is that? That's just like priceless,
Yeah.
So support groups, because like some of the women I spoke with, they talked about just how, they were able to form, different groups like on WhatsApp with their people that they met in their support group. So they could, one person gave an example where she said, she read something on Facebook one day, and she was good all along, whole day at work, everything was great. She was going on, putting on music. And then she happened to just say, okay, let me just go on Facebook before I drive off. And she saw someone putting out their pregnancy announcement. And it was just like, it just came like a ton of bricks. And right away, she just texted her little subgroup, and people just responded, oh, I'm so sorry I had to go through that. So the support was so quick and forthcoming that, right away she felt like, you know what, I'm not really alone in this. Mm-hmm. There are other people there who care about me. And even though they're not physically here with me, but they're supporting me.
Yeah.
And so support groups was by far the biggest thing that people found that was really effective for them through the holidays and all that. Mm-hmm. Support groups is right there, so that was really good for them. I felt a little bit disappointed though about the counseling piece, because there were some people who talked about finding it helpful, but then there were other people who had bad experiences. And I thought to myself, it's time for us in the counseling community to do better. I think, so we need to educate ourselves on the loss and grief of involuntary childlessness, and, not just be prepared to work with death losses. There are other losses apart from death losses. There are non-death losses, and this is just one of them. So it's not like involuntary childlessness is the only non-death loss that people deal with. People deal with all types of losses, but for some reason, the focus is on the death losses, the Kubler-Ross, this is a theory, this is the what, this is the, but then, people go through so many different things. So I think the counseling community needs to just broaden its horizons to understand that people go through different losses. And so we need to be educated and prepared to help people in whatever loss they're going through. and not
Yep.
just put it in this narrow box and say, well, if you're not going through a death, yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's not helpful.
Oh, I 100% agree. And I know I mentioned this in the chat, but Katie Maynard is such a good resource for this. So if you have she does education for therapists around being childless. So if you have a therapist and they're not quite getting it, please refer them to her website, because she hosts workshops, she has educational events, and that is a good way to get the word out. And the other thing I'll just mention, because I think in my personal experience, I actually did have a really good therapist who was able to help me kind of transition from infertility to accepting that I was going to be childless, and kind of working through that with me. I was really lucky in that, but I still felt like my ultimate healing came from once I started making connections within the childless community with others who experienced it. And so, you know, I've been hosting things over the last 4 years that have morphed and taken different forms. But for anyone who is not a part of Lighthouse Women, you can find information at lighthousewomen.org, but that's used to be Gateway Women, and it's a private online community for women who are childless not by choice. We have about 700 members there, and from all over the world, and I'm really loving hosting it. I just started in July. I have been running support groups online for the last 3 years, and we'll be starting those back up again in a few months. So be on the lookout for those if you're looking for they're small support groups. So I limit them to 10 people. And then I do the Childless Collective Summit every year, which will be held this year, I think in October. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to try to do a hybrid event. So there would be an in-person option. And then also still the online, so that people can join online too. So those are kind of the things that I have been building, and then also, you know, working off of what Jody has already built with Lighthouse Women. But if you are looking for support, those are some options. Okay, so let's talk about meaning making, because I know this was one of the things that came up. You said for your participants, what were some of the ways that they were finding meaning outside of motherhood?
Well, for some people, they found meaningful work, like working for a not-for-profit, so doing community work, that became meaningful for them. Other people tried to mentor other people's children. They nurtured their friendships. For some people, though, they said, you know what, I'm still working on it. It wasn't as clear cut as, okay, I'm doing X or I'm doing Y. You know, this is a huge, huge loss. And just to try to find purpose and meaning and going forward, it was a bit much for them just to say, okay, fine, you know, I'm tying it down to this. And one person said to me, you know what, I'm not even sure if I have meaning in my life. So you can see the struggles that, you know, they were going through in terms of just saying, yeah, I found it. I have, it's right here. You know, it wasn't as clear cut as just to say, well, yes, I have found meaning. It's just an ongoing struggle, as it were.
All right, so I have one more question for you, and then I would love to get to some of these questions that have come up in the Q&A box here. So you mentioned in your research that women of color are really underrepresented in the research that's been done on this subject. And I would love to hear from you, you know, why is it important that future research includes the perspectives of women of color? And what do you see as the barriers to finding participants for that?
Well, women of color are a part of this group of involuntary childless women. Hello, I'm right here. So, you know, we're here, right? But I think based on our culture and, you know, how we've been raised and a lot of stuff, everyone will not be as vocal as I am. And I wasn't always this way. It was a journey for me to get to where I am today. But I believe it's important for people of color to be, you know, represented in research so that, you know, we can adequately represent, you know, their side of things. There may be experiences that are unique to them that were not captured in my study because these people did not, you know, volunteer to participate. So consequently, you know, when you have research, whatever benefits come from that research, as a person of color, you will also be able to benefit from that, you know, whatever, you know, findings have come or benefits that have come from that research. You will also be able to receive those benefits. But if you never were a participant in the first place, then, you know, that's not going to be the case. So I think it's really important that, we show up more when it comes on to, taking part in research. And I understand that there are barriers, there have been history shown that there have been things that have happened that, we were not treated correctly and people suffered. And so the trust level is very low in terms of trusting, researchers that they will honor what they say. And then if they tell you that this is what it's black, it really is black and not another color. So that is a big barrier in terms of, can I really trust this person? Also, I think in some cultures, especially I think cultures that like here in the US, individualism is a big thing. It's like, do you boo kind of thing. But, for other cultures where it's collectivism is like, it's about the family. Don't you dare go out there and shame the family. So that sometimes could be a thing where people will not be willing. And some topics are more, personal than others. And this one is a big one, which is very personal. It's very close to our hearts, So people may have reservations about actually divulging information. But I do think there's just so much benefit to being a part of the research.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And taking this even outside of the research realm, this is something that's on my mind a lot because as someone who is trying to create different avenues for community support and community building, I really have pretty easily identified where it seems like there are underrepresented voices, not only just among women of color, but also with the LGBTQIA plus community and women who are childless and single. Actually, men in this regard, I think the voices are really underrepresented as well. So it's interesting because I think it can be easy for me to identify which voices are missing from the public discourse of this. But I have no research to back this up, but one of the things I think about is because there's so much taboo and stigma already attached to being childless, that if you have populations that are already experiencing other forms of oppression and marginalization, it adds those extra layers to being a public voice that makes it not as safe, not as, it just adds those extra layers of barriers. And so I don't have any great solutions, but it is something I think a lot about with my community building of like, how can we make sure that underrepresented voices are being heard and that there are platforms for them, for those who want to be public voices for this, and that we can create spaces that give room for those conversations to be happening. And so yeah, I think it's definitely in research so important. And I think as we are just thinking about community building and what that looks like, that that's also really important and something I think about a lot. So it's on my mind. But okay, so I think that kind of wraps up the questions I had for you. We've got a few questions in the Q&A. So let's just get to the first one. So someone said, any tips on how to start this conversation in a work setting, in a team with colleagues, with children and pregnant colleagues, for example? It's such a tricky balance, and mentioning childlessness seems so unsisterly. There's nothing in my workplace to offer support and guidance.
So in the workplace can be a bit tricky because I think you also have to bear in mind what are the policies that HR has in place, so you have to also be mindful of that. But I would say if it is that you can actually start the conversation with one person, maybe someone in HR, then that would probably be a point person that you could actually have, who could actually help you to get the conversation out on a wider basis. But I think it really has to start with knowing what the policies of the workplace are and just maybe having that first conversation with someone in that capacity in HR. And then maybe you can see how you can take it further. But it has to probably start, with that person in HR.
Yeah. All right. So our next question is, not receiving the right kind of support from family and friends can trigger resentment. At least that's what I feel sometimes. What kind of mechanisms can we put in place to face these uncomfortable feelings? Just explaining ourselves to people?
Well, and family dynamics can be very difficult because sometimes it means that you lose your place in the family. It may mean some additional loss, but it does mean having the conversation, not in a way where it's confrontational, but just to explain that this is where I am, this is how I feel, and when you do X, this is how I feel. but having the conversation and setting boundaries. Now,
Yeah.
boundaries are not always very comfortable, because sometimes when you put a boundary in place and people think that they need to, break this boundary, it causes a problem. But the bottom line is this woman, Lisa Darroux, she does devotions on Proverbs 31 devotions. And she wrote this book on boundaries. I haven't read the book itself, but I've read bits and pieces of it. But she made a very good point. She said, so many times she talked about, responsibility and access. And she said, think about this. If a person, and she said, think about responsibility on a scale of 1 to 10. And so someone only has level 3 responsibility, but you give them level 10 access. So they took your debit card and they went shopping and they bought all these things. And now you have this bill to pay back, and they have showed no remorse at all. And this is just how they operate. And so she talked about the fact that when we consider relationships and people, we have to match the level of responsibility with the access that we give them to ourselves. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to be harmed. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to do this within our families. We have to match the level of responsibility with the level of access. Because if you know someone's responsibility is at a 4 or a 3, giving them level 10 access will not end well. It just will not. So it's like making hard decisions. And I know sometimes when it comes on to family, it's very hard, but I think you just have to decide, what is it that I want for my life? What, do I want to feel better? Do I want to live in a healthier emotional space? What does that look like? And sometimes, unfortunately, we lose people. But I've always said, which is more detrimental, losing someone or losing myself?
Yeah, that's a great thing to keep in mind. And I love also the analogy that you shared about the credit card access. I've never heard that, and that really does kind of put a picture to it. I think one of the things that can be really hard about boundaries is that I think a lot of the coping skills that we have, or the skills around boundaries, or like the skills that we have, come from whatever we learned in our own families. And so if that is something that hasn't happened in families, if you were never taught how to do that, it does take a lot of work, I think, to be able to find those skills and like learn them on your own as an adult. So just a plug for therapy, that like this was some of the most helpful things I learned in therapy, was being able to look outside of my family system and what I had learned, and the kind of norms that were established in my family system that maybe weren't the healthiest, and to be able to develop some new coping skills, new ways of handling things, and to get that support for my individual situation about like, let's role play talking about this. Let's talk about why your family might have this reaction. Like if you could find a good therapist, and I know not everyone has access to therapy, but a good therapist, it can be such a good way to kind of sort through some of these things and learn how to learn new skills that can really help you.
But I also think though, Katie, let's say someone doesn't have access, whether their insurance isn't, whatever it is though. But I think, maybe this is something you and I can talk about. Even like maybe within Lighthouse, this is probably something that I'd be willing to, just educate people, just talk with people, just kind of just say, let's talk about this. Let's role play this. Let's, how do you feel about this? I'd be willing to like facilitate the kind of conversation, because sometimes we just don't understand how to navigate certain situations. But, it's either, we have to choose ourselves. I choose myself first. I'm sorry.
I love that.
I choose myself
first. And I think
first.
we have to, especially when you are in the middle of grief and you have so much that you're already working through, and it almost feels like your heart is just wide open and everything feels so fragile, and it's like you have no armor, right? Like everything's just exposed, that it could make it it just adds so many layers to having to have those conversations. So the next question is, did people express grief over loss of friendships and relationships in general, especially when friends start having kids of their own? This has come up recently for me, and I find myself trying to understand the loss of this friendship, and I really thought would last a lifetime, regardless of having kids.
Right. Oh, yes, they definitely did talk about, losing, one person said as their friends started having kids, that relationship either changed or just dissipated. So people really talked about that. And so I can well imagine, when someone has a child or they get married or some life event, that relationships change. But even though the relationship changed, I don't know that you should necessarily lose that friend You know, we may have to do things differently. We may have less time seeing each other, connecting, but it doesn't necessarily have to change. However, friendship is a two-way street, right? So I have to give something, you have to give something. I provide understanding, you provide understanding. But if someone is not willing to provide that understanding, it's really very difficult for that friendship to continue. Like we
Yeah.
talked about earlier, Katie, when I said, for someone to say to you, are you still sad about having kids? You know, that's kind of a harsh question. But if someone says, I don't really understand your grief, but I'm here for you, then the door is now open for you to have the conversation to say, you know what, this meant X to me, and this is why I feel this way. But if the person's not open to even understanding where you're coming from, it will be very difficult for you to feel, you know, comfortable enough to have the conversation and for the friendship to continue. So it all depends on, you know, the persons in the relationship.
Yeah, and I actually learned a new term that kind of relates to this when I had on Dr. Marissa Franco, who is a friendship expert, and I had a conversation with her about friendships, and she brought up the term of mutuality and how that works in relationships. And it's basically what you're saying, this idea that both people have to be willing to give, and it has to be that mutual experience, or else you're not really going to be able to keep that friendship together. So I was just excited to see that there's an actual word for that, because I hadn't heard it. But yeah, absolutely. Okay, so someone else said, let's see, did you only look at Christianity or any other religious backgrounds in your research?
So my question for that was, it was a broad question. I just asked if they, you know, they were religious or they had a faith. And some people just did not practice faith at all. They weren't religious. And some people were Christian. So I don't think there was another person who practiced another religion. So either they just were not practicing at all, or they were Christians. So those were the persons that showed up in my study.
So he said, in your research, have you found people or communities or cultures that currently are creating positive, validating, transformative grief rituals for not realizing the life dream of having and raising a biological child?
Okay, I was putting my email address in the chat. Someone asked for it. So what was that question that person asked?
So the question was, have you found people or communities that are currently creating positive, validating grief rituals for not realizing the life dream of having and raising a biological child? So yeah, basically, what ritual have you seen rituals that are being created to kind of mark this as something?
No, not really. Well, the only rituals I've seen are like World Childless Week with Steph, with, you know, lighting the candles and then blowing up the candles. And I think was it World Childless Week or was it Jody? There was one where we named our children, and it was something to do with candles also. So I've seen those kind of rituals that we've had, you know, in Gateway and Lighthouse and World Childless Week with Steph. But apart from that, I have not really seen much else apart from what I just mentioned.
Yeah, I've seen a few people like kind of talk about things that they kind of made up on their own that felt significant to them. But this idea of having community rituals or like things that we can participate with loved ones, and I think is so much harder they seem to not really exist. I know there's a woman named Karen Malone who held the Not Mom Summit for 2 different years, and she still has a website still, the Not Mom. I read a really great blog post that she did, like a ritual where people, I hope I got the right one, I'm not mixing it up, but I'm pretty sure it was that they walked through one of the labyrinths, like when you see the circle spirals, they have them a lot at like church grounds or things, that she had people go in and do that and then leave an item that they had planned on giving a baby. So, you know, many of us maybe have bought a onesie or some kind of item that we had planned for a baby, and then had a ritual around like kind of letting that go. So I think there's so much opportunity. I love rituals. I love being able to put something concrete to something that feels very abstract. So maybe that's something we can do as a community, is think about what would those rituals look like, and if there aren't spaces in wider communities for those, maybe we can be thinking about how we can kind of integrate those into our own, like within our own community. Okay, I just have one more question for you, and then I think we can wrap up. So, someone asked, how do you deal with the feelings of anger, bitterness, and dare I say, jealousy when you see a peer get pregnant while you've never even had the chance to try? It's very difficult to be happy for others when you're struggling with your grief.
It definitely is, definitely is. And again, as Katie said, I'll make a plug for therapy there because, it can be helpful, and also the support groups. And I think, again, boundaries. So I would say you don't need to immerse yourself into every single, part of that experience. If you can send a gift to the shower, or, whatever little you can do to acknowledge that, yes, I'm sending you congratulations, but you don't have to be there every moment of the way, kind of immerse yourself. Because sometimes maybe, emotionally, that's not where you're at. And if it's
Yeah.
someone that you're close with, you can say, well, you know what, at this point, I'm not really at this place. So if I don't reach out, just know I'm thinking about you, or I'm happy for
Mhm.
you, or whatever. But you limit yourself having to be so immersed in with the person's life, because that's only going to heighten your grief. And those feelings are absolutely normal.
Yeah.
We see other people having what we, worked so hard in some cases to have and just didn't have. It brings up a lot of anger, even just, watching the news. People are killing their kids, people are abandoning their kids. It's just like crazy stuff's going down. And it's just like, why did you have kids if this is
Mhm.
what you're going to do with them? So
Yeah.
it's very difficult, but I would say therapy definitely, because that will give you some tools to know how to create boundaries, and how to operate within that context of knowing that this is not being selfish. Self-care is not being selfish, but I have to do self-care for myself.
Yeah.
But and still, let someone know, I wish you all the best, XYZ, but I'm not going to be as involved in your present situation as, maybe I would have been otherwise. And
Mhm.
if they can be honest and upfront, then you do that. Otherwise, sometimes you have to, you know, put the focus on yourself. It may sound selfish, but sometimes we have to do that in order
Yeah.
to, maintain our sanity.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that I have started doing is I have a go-to idea for like something I can send to a friend who gets pregnant that like
Mhm.
acknowledges it and sends them like a gift. But I already have like just like one thing that I send to everyone, so I don't have to look on like baby websites or like any registries or anything like that. And so a lot of times when I have a friend that gets pregnant, I will just send a care package that's more for the mom. So like when it's announced, I'll buy like something that has like a nice set of lotions or bath salts or like something that is caring for my friend and not necessarily focused on the pregnancy, but that I can order without feeling triggered, and then I can just like send over. And then same thing, I have such a great suggestion from someone who used to attend the support circles I did, who um, found like a local company that makes these really like fabulous blankets, and they weren't related to chilled like babies at all, but they would work for that. And so she would send those to every time her friends had babies. She would just automatically send that, and she thought, I just liked having that in advance because I could send that away. It showed them I'm thinking about them and caring for them, but I don't have to spend time on like baby sites or looking at anything related to babies. So I think there are some strategies too of, ways that you can maybe think about, if I want my friend to feel supported and I want my friend, like I want to keep this friendship strong, maybe there's ways that I can send a little message or a note or something to them to let them know I'm thinking about them, but also respect my own boundaries of I have limits to like how involved I can be in this or how I can show up. So, um, all right. Well, it's 1:29 my time. I know we have people from all over, so a good time to wrap up. But I just cannot thank you enough, Nisa, for being here with us. This has been such an amazing discussion, and I know it's resonating with everyone because the chat has just been like just lightning fast, going and going and going. So, thank you to everyone who joined live, and for Nisa for being willing to come and share your dissertation with us and the findings. For those of you who are looking for more connection, if you're not already part of Lighthouse Women, I'm putting it in the chat. You can go to lighthousewomen.org and join our online community for childless women. We have sliding scale, so we have financial options if you have need for that. And it's got all kinds of stuff in there for community. And then again, I will be doing my Childless Collective Summit in the fall, and also starting back up my support groups in a few months. So a few different ways to connect. And
Thank you all so much for being here. It's been my pleasure.
yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and just what a gift to have your dissertation focus on this and to be adding to the research base of what's out there for our community. I want to thank you for that. I know I cannot imagine the work that went into,
Oh my
doing this
gosh.
dissertation, even just writing it up. I read through the whole thing, and the whole time I was thinking, I mean, I know how much I haven't done a dissertation, but I know they are just a massive amount of work. And just want to thank you for choosing this as your dissertation subject so that we can all benefit from it and have that literature added to what's out there. So such a gift for us, and to take the time to chat with us today about your findings. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you. It's been a pleasure to get to know you these last few years, and just really appreciate all that you add to our childless community. So thank you so much.
And thank you too, Katie, because your Childless Collective 2021 helped me through. I was in the middle of my dissertation and I'm like, okay, that's it. It's too hard emotionally. I got to go. And the summit came right on time.
Oh, good.
So here we are. So thank you. Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nisa. Thank you to everyone who joined. Bye.
Bye. Thanks again, Katie. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.